Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Chapter 41, Moby Dick. I, Ishmael, was part of that crew. My shouts joined the others, and I swore my oath along with them, shouting even louder and committing more fiercely to my promise because of the fear deep within me. A wild, mystical feeling surged through me. Ahab's relentless quest for revenge felt like my own. I eagerly listened to the stories of that deadly creature, against which all of us had sworn our vows of violence and revenge. For some time, the elusive white whale had haunted the remote seas mostly traveled by sperm whale fishermen. However, not everyone was aware of his existence. Only a few had actually seen him, and even fewer had engaged in battle with him. Due to the many whale ships scattered across the vast ocean, often sailing solo for long stretches without encountering another ship to share news, it took a long time for word of Moby Dick to spread throughout the whaling community. Several vessels reported encountering a massive and dangerous sperm whale that had caused significant damage to those who attacked it and then escaped. Some believed that this whale must have been Moby Dick. Recently, there had been numerous reports of aggression, cunning, and malice from the sperm whales being hunted. Because of this, those who inadvertently clashed with Moby Dick often attributed the fear he inspired to the general dangers of sperm whale hunting rather than to him specifically. As a result, Ahab's earlier encounters with the whale were viewed more as part of the broader dangers of whaling. In the beginning, those who had heard of the white whale and caught a glimpse of him would lower their boats to pursue him just as boldly as they would for any other sperm whale. But soon, the disastrous outcomes of these attempts were not just limited to sprained wrists or broken limbs. They often resulted in death. These repeated failures built up the terror associated with Moby Dick, shaking the courage of many brave hunters who had heard his tale. Wild rumors naturally grew around these shocking events. Just as a struck tree sprouts fungi, incredible stories spread wherever there was an inkling of truth. In maritime life, especially in whaling, rumors flourished far more than on land because whalemen had first-hand experiences with the astonishing and terrifying wonders of the sea. They not only witnessed its greatest marvels, but also fought against them. Alone in remote waters, thousands of miles from any friendly shore, pursuing their dangerous profession, whalemen were surrounded by influences that filled their imaginations with all kinds of grand ideas. No wonder that as rumors about the white whale traveled across vast ocean distances, they began to include strange hints and suggestions of supernatural forces, adding new layers of terror that had nothing to do with what was visibly present. In many cases, the panic Moby Dick incited became so severe that few hunters were willing to risk confronting him, especially after hearing those rumors. There were also deeper, more practical reasons at play. Even today, the legendary fear of the sperm whale has not faded from the minds of whalemen. Some of them, although brave and skilled enough to hunt Greenland or right whales, would still hesitate to engage with a sperm whale, perhaps due to inexperience, incompetence, or sheer fear. Many whalers, especially those from nations that don't sail under the American flag, have never faced a sperm whale, their knowledge of the creature limited to the less formidable ones they usually pursued. Sitting on their decks, these men would listen with a childlike wonder and dread to the strange tales of southern whaling. As if the sperm whale's proven might had cast a shadow over the legends of old, some naturalists, like Olassen and Pavelson, claimed that the sperm whale was not only terrifying to all other sea creatures, but also incredibly bloodthirsty, constantly craving human flesh. Even as late as Cuvier's time, these beliefs persisted. In his Natural History, the Baron stated that when sperm whales are spotted, all fish, including sharks, are gripped by intense fear and often crash into rocks while trying to flee, resulting in instant death. While experiences in the whaling industry may have revised some of these reports, the superstitious beliefs surrounding them could resurface at various points in the hunters' careers. Overwhelmed by the rumors and omens regarding Moby Dick, many fishermen recalled the early days of sperm whaling, when even experienced right whalers were hesitant to embark on such a bold and dangerous pursuit, claiming that while other leviathans might be pursued, chasing the sperm whale was not for mere mortals. Attempting it would mean certain death. There are remarkable documents on this subject. However, there were still those who were willing to chase Moby Dick despite these fears, and many more who, having only heard vague rumors about him without details of any specific calamity or superstitious elements, were brave enough to engage in battle if the opportunity arose. One of the wild ideas that eventually linked Moby Dick to superstitions was the belief that he was everywhere at once, that he had been encountered in completely opposite parts of the ocean at the same time. Although those who believed in such ideas must have been gullible, there was some faint hint of superstitious validity behind them. Just as the secrets of ocean currents remain unknown even to the most learned researchers, the hidden paths of the sperm whale beneath the surface remain largely unexplainable to those who chase them. This has led to curious and contradictory theories, especially about how the whale can dive deep and then suddenly travel vast distances with incredible speed. It is well known among American and English whalers, and was documented years ago by Scoresby, that some whales have been caught in the far northern Pacific with the barbs of harpoons from Greenland lodged in their bodies. In some cases, the time between these two attacks was believed to be only a few days. This led some whalemen to speculate that the Northwest Passage, a long-standing mystery for humans, was never a challenge for the whale. In this way, the incredible stories of the inland Strelo Mountain in Portugal, where it was said that a lake at the top contained the wrecks of ships floating to the surface, and the even more fantastical tale of the Arethusa Fountain near Syracuse, whose waters were believed to flow from the Holy Land through an underground passage, are almost matched by the real-life experiences of whalers. Confronted with such wonders, and knowing that the white whale had escaped alive from numerous daring attempts to catch him, it's no surprise that some whalemen took their superstitions even further. They claimed that Moby Dick was not only everywhere, but also immortal, since immortality is just ubiquity over time. They believed that even if spears were driven into his sides, he would still swim away unscathed, and if he ever did spout thick blood, it would be a mere illusion. For miles away, in bloodless waters, his pure spouts would be seen again. But even without these supernatural beliefs, there was enough about this creature's physical presence and undeniable nature to inspire a deep sense of awe. It wasn't just his unusual size that set him apart from other sperm whales, but rather his distinct snow-white, wrinkled forehead and high, pyramid-shaped white hump. These features allowed those familiar with him to recognize him from a distance, even in the vast, uncharted seas. The rest of his body was streaked, spotted, and marbled with a shadowy hue, earning him the name of the white whale, one that was truly justified by his striking appearance as he glided through the dark blue sea at high noon, leaving behind a creamy, milky white wake that sparkled with golden gleams. Yet, it wasn't his extraordinary size, unique color, or even his deformed lower jaw that instilled fear in others. It was the remarkable, intelligent malice he had repeatedly shown during attacks. More than anything, his cunning retreats were terrifying. While swimming away from his excited pursuers, he would suddenly turn and charge at them, either smashing their boats to pieces or sending them fleeing back to their ships in panic. Several fatalities had already occurred during attempts to capture him. While similar incidents, though not widely reported on land, were not unusual in whaling, the sheer ferocity of the white whale's attacks made every injury or death seem intentional, rather than the act of a mindless creature. Imagine the furious desperation of his most reckless hunters when, surrounded by the wreckage of their boats and the injured bodies of their comrades, they swam from the chaos of the whale's wrath into the calm sunlight that seemed to mock them, as if celebrating a wedding or a birth. 3 of their boats were destroyed around him, with men and oars caught in the swirling waters. One captain, seizing a line knife from his damaged boat, charged at the whale like a duelist, blindly trying to reach the depths of the whale's life with his 6-inch blade. That captain was Ahab. It was then that Moby Dick swept his sickle-shaped lower jaw beneath him, taking Ahab's leg as effortlessly as a mower cuts grass in a field. No hired assassin from Turkey, Venice, or Malaysia could have struck him with more apparent malice. It's no wonder, then, that since that near-fatal encounter, Ahab has harbored an intense desire for revenge against the whale. In his frantic obsession, he began to see Moby Dick not only as the source of all his physical pain, but also as the embodiment of all his mental and spiritual frustrations. The white whale became a monomaniacal representation of all the malicious forces that can consume a person, leaving them with half a heart and half a soul. This malignancy, which has existed from the beginning of time, and to which even modern Christians attribute a portion of the world's woes, was not worshipped by Ahab like the ancient Ophites of the East revered their devilish statues. Instead, he delusionally transferred this idea to the hated white whale, pitting his mutilated self against it. Everything that drives him to madness and torment, all that stirs up the chaos of existence, all truth tinged with malice, all that breaks the spirit and clouds the mind, all the subtle demons of life and thought, all evil to Ahab, were embodied and made confrontable in Moby Dick. He placed upon the whale's white hump the totality of all the rage and hatred that humanity has felt since Adam, and as if his chest were a mortar, he unleashed the fury of his heart upon it. It's unlikely that Ahab's obsession with the whale began right when he lost his leg. At that moment, when he lunged at the creature with a knife, he was merely giving in to a sudden burst of anger. When the whale struck him, he probably only felt the intense pain of his injury, nothing more. However, once he was forced to head back home and spent long months dealing with his pain through the harsh winter around the Patagonian Cape, Ahab's physical suffering and emotional turmoil began to blend together, ultimately driving him mad. It's almost certain that it was only on the return journey, after the encounter, that his final obsession took hold. During the voyage, he would occasionally lose his mind completely, and despite having lost a leg, he still had enough strength in his body, intensified by his delirium, that his crew had to strap him down in his hammock as he raved on. He was in a kind of straitjacket, swaying with the violent movements of the ship in the storm. Later, when they sailed into calmer waters and the ship floated through the tranquil tropics with the sails set gently, it seemed like Ahab's madness had faded with the rough seas. He emerged from his dark cabin, pale but composed, issuing calm orders once again. His crew thanked God that the terrible madness seemed to be gone. Yet even then, deep down, Ahab was still raging. Human madness can often be cunning and elusive. Just when you think it's gone, it might have transformed into something more subtle. Ahab's full insanity didn't disappear. It merely tightened its grip, like the unyielding flow of the Hudson River as it narrows through the Highland Gorge. Even though he seemed to be coming back to sanity, none of Ahab's broad madness had been left behind. In fact, none of his natural intellect had perished either. What had once been a living force now became a tool. If such a wild comparison can stand, his special obsession stormed over his general sanity, seizing it and directing all its concentrated energy against its own mad target. Far from losing his strength, Ahab, with this singular purpose, had 1,000 times more power than he ever had when he was rationally focused on any reasonable goal. That's a lot to take in, but Ahab's deeper, darker nature remains unexplored. It's a fruitless effort to make profound ideas popular, as all truth is inherently deep. So, let's leave behind this grand place, the Hotel de Cluny, and journey to the vast Roman baths of Thermes. There, far beneath the fantastical towers of human achievement, lies the root of true greatness, the essence of humanity, buried among antiquities, like a regal figure adorned with relics of the past. Like a broken throne, the great gods mock this captive king. He sits patiently like a caryatid, bearing on his frozen brow the weight of ages. Descend there, you proud, somber souls, and question that noble yet sorrowful king. He bears a family resemblance. Yes, he has fathered you, you young exiled royalties. Only from your grim ancestor will the long-held state secrets be revealed. In his heart, Ahab had some awareness of this. He realized that all his means were rational, but his motives and goals were mad. Yet he felt powerless to kill, change, or escape this truth. He also knew he had long deceived humanity, and to some extent, he still did. But his deception was only within his own perception, not something he could control. However, he managed to deceive so well that when he finally stepped ashore with his ivory leg, no one in Nantucket thought anything of it beyond natural grief for the terrible loss he had suffered. People also attributed his undeniable madness at sea to a similar cause. And so the brooding mood that lingered on his brow until the very day of the Pequod's departure was also seen as a natural consequence. It's not far-fetched to think that instead of doubting his fitness for another whaling voyage because of these dark signs, the calculating residents of Nantucket might have thought that these very reasons made him even more fit and eager for a pursuit as wild and brutal as hunting whales. Consumed by his inner turmoil and tormented by an unshakable obsession, he would seem like the perfect person to launch an iron harpoon and confront the most terrifying creatures. Or, if thought physically incapable, he would still seem highly qualified to urge and rally his crew to the attack. Regardless of the reason, one thing is certain. Ahab set out on this voyage with the single, all-consuming goal of hunting the white whale. Had any of his old friends on shore even suspected what was stirring inside him, they would have swiftly taken the ship from such a madman. They were focused on profitable journeys, where gains were counted in dollars. Ahab was intent on a daring, relentless, and supernatural vengeance. Here was this gray-haired, godless old man, chasing a monstrous whale across the globe, leading a crew mostly made up of renegades, castaways, and cannibals, morally weakened by Starbuck's ineffective virtue, Stubbs' careless joviality, and Flask's mediocrity. This crew, so poorly led, seemed handpicked by some dark fate to aid him in his obsessive quest for revenge. It's remarkable how they resonated with Ahab's fury. Sometimes it felt as if his hatred was their own. The white whale was as much their enemy as it was his. How all this came to be, and what the white whale represented to them, or how he might have seemed to embody the unseen demons of life, this is something I cannot fully explain. The inner miner within us all digs deep, but how can one know where his tunnel leads just from the muffled sound of his pick? Who doesn't feel the inescapable pull? What small boat can remain still when being towed by a massive ship? I, for one, surrendered to the moment and the environment. But even while rushing to confront the whale, all I could see in that creature was the deadliest threat. Chapter 42. The Whiteness of the Whale. What the white whale meant to Ahab has been hinted at, but what it sometimes meant to me remains to be explained. Apart from the more obvious reasons to be alarmed by Moby Dick, there was another feeling, a kind of vague, nameless horror, that would occasionally overwhelm me. It was so intense that it overshadowed all other fears, but it was so mystical and hard to define that I almost feel hopeless trying to explain it. The thing that disturbed me most about the whale was its whiteness. But how can I truly convey that feeling? Still, I must try to explain it, or else all these chapters would be pointless. In many cases, the color white enhances beauty, as seen in marble, camellia flowers, and pearls. Various cultures have even recognized white as a symbol of royalty. The old kings of Pegu gave the title Lord of the White Elephants to their most important rulers, and the kings of Siam included a white elephant on their royal flag. Even the flag of Hanover bore the image of a snow-white horse, and the Austrian Empire, which succeeded Rome in power, made white its imperial color. White has even been associated with the supremacy of the white man over other races. Beyond this, white often symbolizes happiness, like in ancient Rome, where a white stone marked a joyful day. It also represents many noble qualities, like the innocence of brides or the wisdom of the elderly. Among Native Americans, the white belt of wampum was the highest symbol of honor. In other places, white represents the majesty of justice, worn by judges in their robes, and it adds dignity to the horses that pull royal carriages. Even in religious traditions, white is a symbol of divine purity and power. The Persian fire worshippers held the white flame as the holiest, and in Greek mythology, the god Zeus took the form of a white bull. The Iroquois considered the white dog sacred, and their midwinter festival was centered around its sacrifice as an offering to their great spirit. Even in Christian traditions, the white robes of priests are linked to the Latin word for white, and white is used in the Catholic Church to celebrate Christ's passion. In the Bible, St. John's vision of heaven shows the redeemed wearing white robes, and the elders stand clothed in white before the white throne of God. Yet despite all these associations with purity, nobility, and joy, there is something unsettling about whiteness. It has a unique quality that can invoke panic more effectively than even the color of blood. This quality makes whiteness, when associated with something terrifying, even more frightening. Consider the white bear of the Arctic and the white shark of tropical seas. Their smooth whiteness gives them an otherworldly horror. Their ghostly white color makes them even more disturbing than they already are. For example, the polar bear's white fur, which seems to symbolize innocence, contrasts sharply with its vicious nature, creating an unnatural tension that makes it terrifying. Even though the polar bear's whiteness might seem harmless, it's the key element that makes it so unsettling. Similarly, the white shark's ghostly white appearance amplifies its deadly stillness. The French even named it requin, a word linked to the requiem mass, which refers to the peacefulness of death. Its whiteness reinforces the sense of a lurking, silent predator. Think of the albatross, which fills people with wonder and fear as it soars across the sky. Its whiteness gives it an almost spiritual presence. When I first saw an albatross during a storm near Antarctica, it seemed like an angelic figure, with pure white feathers and an arched, majestic wingspan. Although it wasn't hurt, it cried out like a tormented soul, and its strange eyes seemed to reveal mysteries beyond human understanding. I was overwhelmed by its appearance, so white and vast, and for a moment I lost all connection to the world of men. I later asked a sailor what kind of bird it was, and he casually replied, "A goni," a name I had never heard. Later, I learned it was another name for the albatross, which made me realize that the bird had already cast its spell on me long before I even knew what it was. Its whiteness was what struck me most, far more than any other color could have. The majestic white horse of the American plains also held a similar power. Known as the white steed of the prairies, it led massive herds of wild horses with an air of royalty and pride. Its flowing white mane and powerful presence made it seem like a creature from another world. The Native Americans regarded this horse with awe and reverence, attributing to it a spiritual power that inspired both worship and fear. But whiteness doesn't always carry a sense of glory. Sometimes it is associated with something unnatural or repulsive, like in the case of albino people. Though physically they are no different from others, their all-encompassing whiteness gives them a strange and unsettling appearance that can cause discomfort, even to their own family members. In nature, whiteness can also evoke feelings of terror. The white squall, a deadly storm in the southern seas, is named after its snowy appearance, which adds to its ominous reputation. History also shows how human malice has used whiteness for symbolic terror, such as when the White Hoods of Ghent, masked in white, murdered their enemies. Even death itself is associated with whiteness. The pale, marble-like appearance of a corpse is often the most striking feature, symbolizing the finality of life. This is why we wrap the dead in white shrouds, and why ghosts are often imagined as white, ethereal figures. Even in the Bible, death is portrayed as riding a pale horse. So, although whiteness can symbolize beauty, purity, and nobility, it also has a darker side that can evoke fear and dread. This contrast between the divine and the terrifying is difficult to fully understand or explain. We can only attempt to grasp it by looking at the many examples where whiteness plays a role in heightening the sense of the unknown or the terrifying. Let us explore further. But such an exploration requires subtlety, and only those with a vivid imagination can truly follow along. Although many people may have shared these impressions, few are fully aware of them or able to recall them. First, when a sailor approaches the coasts of foreign lands and hears the roar of breakers at night, he becomes alert and a bit anxious, sharpening his senses. But in the same situation, if he's called from his hammock to see the ship sailing through a sea that appears milky white in the dark, as if white bears were swimming around him, he feels a deep, superstitious dread. The eerie, ghostly whiteness of the waters terrifies him more than an actual ghost. Even if the instruments tell him he's safe, his heart sinks, and he won't rest until he's back in clear blue water. Yet where's the sailor who would admit it wasn't so much the fear of hidden rocks, but that horrifying whiteness that shook me? Second, to the native of Peru, the sight of the snow-covered Andes doesn't inspire fear, except perhaps in imagining the eternal frozen desolation at such high altitudes and the terror of getting lost in such inhuman wilderness. Similarly, a backwoodsman in the west might see a vast snow-covered prairie without much concern, even when the whiteness stretches endlessly without the break of a tree or twig. But to a sailor, gazing at the Antarctic seas is a different story. There, frost and wind combine to create a terrifying frozen landscape, a graveyard of ice with monuments and crosses of shattered ice mocking him. But you might say, isn't all this talk of whiteness just the ramblings of a scared soul? Are you giving in to fear, Ishmael? Tell me, why does a strong young colt born in the peaceful valleys of Vermont, far from any wild beasts, suddenly panic if you shake a fresh buffalo hide near him? He can't even see it. He only smells its wild animal scent. And yet he snorts, paws the ground, and his eyes bulge in terror. There's no memory in him of being attacked by wild animals in his peaceful home, so that musky smell doesn't remind him of any past dangers. What does this colt from New England know about the wild bison of distant Oregon? No, what you're seeing in this colt is the instinctive awareness of the danger in the world. Even though he's thousands of miles away from Oregon, when he smells that wild musk, it's as if the trampling bison herds are right there with him, just like they are with the untamed foal out on the prairies. And so it is with me. The milky waves, the frosty mountains, and the snow-covered prairies, they're like that buffalo hide to the frightened colt. Neither of us knows exactly what we fear, but we both sense that something terrible must exist out there. While much of the world may seem full of love, the unseen realms are filled with fear. Yet, we still haven't figured out why whiteness carries such a powerful effect on the soul. And even stranger, why, as we've seen, it's both a symbol of spiritual purity, the very veil of God, and yet also the most terrifying thing in the world. Is it because its lack of definition suggests the heartless emptiness of the universe, hinting at annihilation when we look at the white depths of the Milky Way? Or is it because whiteness isn't really a color at all, but the absence of color while also containing all colors at once? Is it this strange contradiction that makes a snowy landscape feel so empty, so blank, that it feels almost like atheism, a vast, colorless void we shrink away from? And when we consider the idea that all earthly colors, the beauty of sunsets, forests, butterflies, and even the blushing cheeks of young girls, are not actually real, but are illusions, only reflections of light, then it's as if nature herself is a deceptive mask. Beneath all the vibrant colors lies a cold, empty truth. When we look further and realize that the light itself, the source of all color, is inherently white and would render everything in its own blank, pale hue if not filtered through something else, then the whole universe seems like a pale, sickened place. It's like staring directly at the world without any filter, and all we see is the white shroud of death. This is what the albino whale represents. So do you wonder now why we chase it so fiercely? Chapter 43. Hark! Shh! Did you hear that noise, Kabako? It was the middle of the night watch. The moon was bright, and the sailors were standing in a line, passing buckets of water from a barrel in the middle of the ship to one near the back. They stood mostly on the sacred ground of the quarterdeck, being careful not to speak or make any noise with their feet. The buckets moved silently from hand to hand, with only the occasional flap of a sail and the steady hum of the ship cutting through the water. In the middle of this quiet, Archie, one of the sailors standing near the hatches, whispered to his neighbor, a sailor named Kabako. Shh! Did you hear that noise, Kabako? Take the bucket, will you, Archie? What noise are you talking about? There it is again, under the hatches. Don't you hear it? It sounded like a cough. A cough? You're imagining things. Just pass the bucket along. There it is again. It sounds like 2 or 3 people turning over in their sleep. Come on, man. Stop it already. It's probably those 3 soggy biscuits you had for supper making noises in your stomach. Now focus on the bucket. Say what you want, but I have sharp ears. Yeah, you're the guy who claimed to hear that old Quaker lady's knitting needles 50 miles out at sea from Nantucket. You sure are. Go ahead and laugh, but we'll see. Listen, Kabako, I think there's someone hiding down in the hold who hasn't come up to deck yet. And I think the captain knows about it, too. I overheard Stubb telling Flask during the morning watch that something was up. Enough! Just pass the bucket! Chapter 44. The Chart. If you had followed Captain Ahab into his cabin after the storm that hit the night after he had made that wild pact with his crew, you would have seen him go to a storage locker and pull out a large, wrinkled roll of yellowing sea charts. He spread them out on his bolted-down table. Then, sitting down, he intensely studied the lines and markings on the charts, and with slow but deliberate strokes, he added new routes to blank spaces. Every so often, he'd glance at old logbooks beside him, which recorded the times and places where sperm whales had been spotted or captured on past voyages by various ships. As he worked, the heavy pewter lamp above him, hanging by chains, swung with the motion of the ship, casting flickering light and shadows across his furrowed brow. It almost seemed as though, while Ahab was tracing lines on his charts, some invisible force was also marking new lines on his deeply wrinkled forehead. But it wasn't just this particular night that Ahab studied his charts in solitude. Nearly every night, he brought them out, erasing some pencil marks and making new ones. With maps of all 4 oceans spread before him, Ahab navigated a maze of currents and eddies, all in pursuit of the one obsessive goal that consumed his soul. To someone unfamiliar with the habits of whales, it might seem like a hopeless and absurd task to track down a single creature in the vast, uncharted oceans of the world. But not to Ahab. He knew all the tides and currents, and by calculating where the sperm whale's food would drift and recalling the regular seasons for hunting whales in certain latitudes, he could make educated guesses, almost certainties, about when and where to search for his prey. The fact that sperm whales return to specific waters at certain times of the year is so well established that many whale hunters believe that if sperm whales could be studied across the world, their migrations would be found to be as predictable as the movements of herring or the migrations of swallows. Based on this idea, some have tried to create detailed migration charts for the sperm whale. In fact, since this was written, a circular was issued by Lieutenant Maury of the National Observatory, Washington, in April 1851, confirming that such a chart was being created. This chart divides the ocean into sections, each 5 degrees in latitude and longitude, and records how many days in each month whales have been spotted in those sections. Moreover, when traveling from one feeding ground to another, sperm whales seem to swim in invisible pathways or veins, guided by some instinct, perhaps even a divine intelligence. They follow these routes so precisely that no ship, sailing by any chart, could match their accuracy. Even though each whale swims a straight, unwavering course, these pathways are usually a few miles wide. Still, they can be so predictable that a whale ship's lookout, scanning the horizon from the mast, can almost count on spotting them at certain times and places. So, not only could Ahab expect to find Moby Dick at known feeding grounds, but even in crossing vast stretches of ocean between these locations, he could position himself to have a decent chance of spotting the whale. At first glance, Ahab's plan to hunt Moby Dick across the world's oceans seemed impossible, maybe even delusional. But in reality, it wasn't. Although sperm whales have regular seasons for visiting certain areas, it doesn't necessarily mean that the same groups of whales will return to the same place year after year. However, there have been rare cases where whales were found in the same spot in consecutive seasons. So even though Moby Dick had been sighted, for example, in the Seychelles in the Indian Ocean or in Volcano Bay off the coast of Japan, it didn't mean the whale would always appear in those same places in future seasons. Instead, those spots seemed more like brief stops for the whale, temporary resting places rather than permanent homes. Ahab knew this, but he also understood that at a certain time and place, the odds of encountering Moby Dick increased. This time and place, known as the season on the line, referred to a specific period when Moby Dick had been regularly sighted, lingering in those waters like the sun pausing at a point in the zodiac. It was there, during this season, that many deadly encounters with the white whale had occurred. And it was there, in those haunted waters, where Ahab's desire for revenge had been born. But Ahab wasn't the type to put all his hopes on one event, no matter how promising it seemed. He wouldn't let himself rest, driven by his relentless pursuit of vengeance. The Pequod had sailed from Nantucket just as the season on the line was beginning. There was no way for Ahab to reach the equatorial Pacific in time to join the hunt there. Instead, he would spend the next year hunting whales across the world, hoping that Moby Dick, wandering far from his usual grounds, might cross paths with the Pequod in some distant sea, whether in the Persian Gulf, the Bay of Bengal, or the China Seas. But even with all this careful planning, it still seemed like madness to expect to recognize one lone whale in the vast ocean. Yet, to Ahab, Moby Dick's unique snow-white brow and hump made him unmistakable. Ahab would often mutter to himself, "I've marked him, and he won't escape. His broad fins are scarred and notched like a lost sheep's ear." And with this thought, Ahab would sink into deep reflection, his mind racing until exhaustion forced him to seek relief in the open air of the deck. Ahab's quest for revenge consumed him. His sleep was haunted by vivid, torturous dreams, and he'd wake with clenched fists, his nails digging into his palms. Sometimes the torment within him would grow so intense that he'd burst from his cabin in the middle of the night, his mind on fire. These outbursts weren't signs of weakness, though. They were the clearest proof of Ahab's obsession. At such moments, the man who had gone to sleep in his hammock wasn't the same man who woke up in terror. It was as if Ahab's soul, temporarily freed from his fevered mind during sleep, tried to escape the intense madness that drove him. But Ahab's mind, driven by the sheer force of his obsession, had taken on a life of its own, pushing him to the brink of insanity. In his relentless pursuit of vengeance, Ahab had created a monster within himself, a creature that now fed on his own heart, much like the vulture that eternally devours Prometheus. Chapter 45. The Affidavit. As far as the story in this book goes, and in connection with a few interesting and peculiar habits of sperm whales, the previous chapter is one of the most important you'll find here. However, the main points raised need to be explained further to be fully understood, and to remove any doubts from those who may be skeptical due to their lack of knowledge on the subject. I don't intend to tackle this methodically, but rather aim to make my point through separate examples, based on my own reliable experiences as a whaleman. From these examples, I believe the conclusion I'm reaching will naturally become clear. First, I personally know of 3 cases where a whale, after being struck by a harpoon, managed to escape, only to be caught again later, in one case 3 years later, by the same harpooner, and killed. In each instance, the 2 harpoons, both marked with the same distinctive symbol, were found in the whale's body. In one case, 3 years passed between the 2 strikes, and I think it might have been even longer. In the meantime, the man who had harpooned the whale had gone on a trading voyage to Africa, ventured deep inland on a discovery expedition, and spent nearly 2 years traveling through dangerous regions filled with threats like snakes, tigers, and disease. Meanwhile, the whale had likely traveled all over the globe, but eventually they met again, and the man killed the whale. I witnessed 2 of these events myself, and saw the marked harpoons removed from the dead whales. In the case where 3 years had passed, I was present both times, and I recognized a distinctive mark, a large mole under the whale's eye from the first encounter. These are just 3 examples I know to be true, but I've heard of many more from trustworthy sources. Secondly, it's well known in the sperm whale hunting industry, although not to people on land, that certain whales have gained widespread recognition over time. These whales became famous not just because of their physical features, as whales with distinct markings are usually killed quickly and turned into valuable oil, but because of their dangerous reputations. Much like how people avoid angering a powerful person, many whalemen were content to merely acknowledge these whales from a distance, not daring to engage them for fear of disaster. These famous whales were not only well known, but also earned names and reputations, much like historical figures. Timor Tom, scarred like an iceberg, was known to lurk in the Straits of Timor. New Zealand Jack terrorized ships near his region. Morquan, king of Japan, was famous for his spout resembling a white cross, and Don Miguel was known for the mysterious markings on his back. These whales were as well known to whale hunters as Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great are to historians. But that's not all. New Zealand Tom and Don Miguel, after causing significant damage to many boats, were eventually hunted down and killed by determined captains, much like a captain from colonial times might hunt down a notorious enemy. Now is a good time to bring up a few other points that I think are important to understanding the story of the white whale, especially the final confrontation. It's one of those frustrating situations where the truth requires as much explanation as fiction does. Many people, especially those unfamiliar with the world of whaling, might dismiss the story of Moby Dick as a wild exaggeration or a bizarre metaphor without understanding the real dangers of whaling. First, while most people have some vague idea of how dangerous whaling can be, they have no real understanding of how frequently these dangers occur. One reason for this is that very few of the accidents and deaths that happen in the whaling industry ever get reported to the public. For example, if a man is pulled to the bottom of the sea by a whale off the coast of New Guinea right now, do you think his death will be mentioned in tomorrow's newspaper? No, because the mail service between here and New Guinea is unreliable. In fact, have you ever heard any real news from New Guinea? On one particular voyage to the Pacific, I encountered 30 different ships, and every single one had lost men to whales. Some had even lost entire crews. For every gallon of oil that's burned in your lamps, a drop of human blood has been spilled. Secondly, people on land might have some idea that a whale is a massive and powerful creature, but when I tell them specific stories about a whale's strength and size, they often think I'm joking. But I swear I'm not exaggerating in the slightest. Fortunately, I can back up my point with evidence that doesn't rely on my own experiences. The fact is this: a sperm whale is, in some cases, powerful, intelligent, and malicious enough to deliberately ram, destroy, and sink a large ship. And more importantly, sperm whales have actually done this. First, in 1820, the ship Essex, commanded by Captain Pollard of Nantucket, was sailing in the Pacific Ocean. One day, the crew spotted whale spouts, lowered their boats, and chased a group of sperm whales. After wounding several whales, a huge one escaped and charged straight at the ship. With a forceful headbutt, it hit the hull so hard that within 10 minutes, the ship sank. No part of the wreck was ever found. After enduring extreme hardships, some of the crew made it to land in their small boats. Captain Pollard eventually returned home and set out on another voyage, but this second ship was also wrecked on unknown rocks. After losing his second ship, Captain Pollard gave up sailing for good. As of today, he still lives in Nantucket. I've met Owen Chase, who was the first mate on the Essex during the incident, read his detailed account, and spoken with his son, all near the location of the tragedy. From Chase's account, everything pointed to the whale's attack being deliberate, not just an accident. It attacked the ship twice, with short breaks between, both times from angles that would cause the most damage. It combined the speed of both the ship and itself for maximum impact. The whale looked terrifying, full of anger and fury. It seemed to be seeking revenge after we had injured 3 of its fellow whales. Later, as Chase drifted in an open boat at night, almost giving up hope of reaching any land, he reflected. The dark ocean and its waves didn't scare me. Thoughts of storms or hidden rocks seemed trivial. My mind was consumed by the image of the wreck and the whale's terrifying and vengeful behavior. In another section of his narrative, Chase refers to the whale's attack as mysterious and deadly. Second, in 1807, the Nantucket ship Union was lost off the Azores due to a similar whale attack. However, I haven't come across any official records of this incident, though I've heard stories from whalers now and then. Third, about 18 or 20 years ago, a Commodore commanding an American warship was having dinner with whaling captains in Oahu. During their conversation about whales, the Commodore expressed skepticism about the strength of sperm whales, claiming they couldn't possibly damage his warship. But just weeks later, on his way to Valparaiso, his ship was struck by a large sperm whale. The whale hit his ship so hard that despite all efforts to pump water out, they had to sail to the nearest port for repairs. This event might have been providential, much like Saul's conversion. The sperm whale tolerates no foolishness. In Langsdorff's Voyages, which is especially interesting to me, he recounts an event from a Russian expedition. Captain Langsdorff writes that in May, their ship was sailing in the open sea when a giant whale, bigger than the ship itself, surfaced directly in front of them. The ship hit the whale, causing it to raise the ship 3 feet out of the water. They thought they had struck a rock, but the whale simply swam away, leaving the ship miraculously undamaged. The captain in this story, De Wolf, is my uncle, and he has confirmed the truth of this event. The ship wasn't large, but my uncle had purchased it after trading away his original vessel. In another tale, Lionel Wafer describes a similar experience when his ship, sailing near modern-day Juan Fernandez, was struck with such force that the crew thought they had hit a rock. The shock was so sudden that guns leaped from their mounts and men were thrown from their hammocks. It later turned out to be an earthquake, though Wafer suggests that it might have been caused by a whale hitting the ship from below. I could share more stories about the sperm whale's strength and aggression. For instance, sperm whales have been known to chase whaling boats back to their ships and even attack the ships themselves, enduring spears thrown from the decks. The English ship Pusey Hall has its own tale to tell. In some cases, whales have been tied to ships with ropes, pulling the vessels through the water like a horse pulling a cart. After being wounded, sperm whales often seem to act not just in blind rage, but with deliberate plans to destroy their pursuers. Let me finish with one more historical example to show that the incredible events in this book are backed by facts. In the 6th century, the historian Procopius wrote about a sea monster in the Sea of Marmara that destroyed ships for over 50 years. Although Procopius didn't specify the type of creature, it was likely a sperm whale, given the damage it caused to ships. Modern evidence shows that sperm whales have occasionally entered the Mediterranean Sea, and it's reasonable to believe that Procopius's sea monster was one of them. Chapter 46. Surmises. Though Ahab was consumed by his obsession with capturing Moby Dick and seemed willing to sacrifice everything for that goal, he may have been too entrenched in the habits of a seasoned whaler to completely abandon the other tasks of the voyage. Or, if that wasn't the case, there were other motives guiding his actions. Even considering his obsession, it would be overthinking to suggest that his hatred for Moby Dick extended to all sperm whales, making him kill more in hopes of increasing the chances of finding the one he hunted. But even if that theory is flawed, there were still other factors influencing him. To achieve his goal, Ahab needed tools, and men, being flawed, are the tools most likely to break down. For instance, while he held some sway over Starbuck, it was clear that his influence didn't fully extend to Starbuck's spirit, just as physical strength doesn't guarantee intellectual dominance. Starbuck's body and will might belong to Ahab as long as Ahab could manipulate his mind, but Ahab knew that deep down, the first mate hated the mission. Starbuck, given the chance, would eagerly distance himself from Ahab's obsession, or even try to sabotage it. Since it could be a long time before they spotted the white whale, Starbuck was likely to rebel unless everyday practical reasons kept him in line. Moreover, Ahab's madness concerning Moby Dick was demonstrated by his cleverness in recognizing that the hunt couldn't be sustained with its full terror constantly at the forefront. The true horror of the voyage had to be kept in the background, as too much contemplation without action would erode crew courage. His officers and men needed something more immediate to focus on during their long watches at sea. Even though the crew had eagerly embraced the quest at first, sailors are notoriously fickle, easily swayed by changes in weather and circumstance. To keep them focused, they needed smaller, more immediate tasks to occupy their minds. Ahab also understood human nature well enough to know that while people may, in moments of passion, rise above base desires, these moments are fleeting. He believed that at their core, people are driven by self-interest. Even if the hunt for Moby Dick stirred a sense of adventure in his wild crew, they would still need to satisfy their more basic needs. Just like the Knights of the Crusades, who didn't travel thousands of miles solely for a noble cause, but also took what they could along the way, Ahab knew his crew wouldn't be content with just chasing a whale for glory. They would want money, too. Though they might scoff at the idea of cash now, after months without any prospect of it, their desire for money could lead them to rebel. There was another, more personal reason for Ahab's actions. Having impulsively revealed the true, private purpose of the voyage, Ahab knew he had opened himself up to the charge of overstepping his authority. If his crew chose to, they could legally and morally refuse to obey him, even taking control of the ship by force. To protect himself from the accusation of usurpation and its possible consequences, Ahab had to be extremely careful, using his intellect, strength, and vigilance to manage the crew and their changing moods. For all these reasons, Ahab realized he had to maintain the ship's original mission to some extent, following the usual customs of a whaling voyage. He needed to appear fully invested in the typical work of a whaler, not just his singular obsession with Moby Dick. Regardless of all this, Ahab's voice was now often heard ordering the crew on the mastheads to stay alert and report even the sighting of a porpoise. This watchfulness soon paid off. Chapter 47. The Mapmaker. It was a cloudy, hot afternoon, and the sailors were lazily lounging on the deck or staring blankly into the grayish waters. Queequeg and I were quietly working on weaving a sword mat to reinforce our boat's lashings. The entire scene felt so calm and subdued, with an air that seemed to hint at something deeper, that every silent sailor seemed lost in their own thoughts. I was helping Queequeg with the mat, acting almost like his assistant. As I kept threading the marline through the long yarns of the warp with my hand, Queequeg, standing to the side, would occasionally slide his heavy wooden sword between the threads and, while staring out at the sea, absent-mindedly pushed the yarn into place. The strange, dreamlike atmosphere aboard the ship, broken only by the occasional dull sound of the sword, made it feel as though this was the loom of time itself. I felt like a mere shuttle, mindlessly weaving the threads of fate. The warp, with its fixed, unchanging threads, seemed like necessity, and I thought to myself that with my own hands, I was weaving my destiny into those unalterable lines. Meanwhile, Queequeg's indifferent sword would sometimes hit the threads at different angles, affecting how the final fabric looked. I realized then that his sword represented chance, free will, and necessity, all working together. The straight warp of necessity, unchangeable in its ultimate direction, allowed free will to weave between its threads. Even chance, though limited by both necessity and free will, still had its say, sometimes guiding events in unexpected ways. We were deep into our work when I was startled by a strange, long, and otherworldly sound. I stopped what I was doing, the thread slipping from my hand, and looked up at the sky as if the sound had come from the clouds. High up in the ship's rigging stood Tashtego, the wild harpooner from Gay Head, his body leaning forward, his hands stretched out like a wand, and every so often he would shout again. It was likely that the same sound was echoing from the lookouts on other whaling ships across the sea, but none could match the wild and musical tone of Tashtego's cries. As he stood high above us, peering eagerly toward the horizon, he seemed like a prophet, calling out the signs of fate. "There she blows! There she blows!" Where? To the leeward, about 2 miles off, a whole school of them. Suddenly, the ship burst into activity. The sperm whale blows with the same regularity as a clock ticking, and that's how whalers can distinguish them from other types of whales. "There go the flukes," Tashtego cried as the whales dove and disappeared beneath the surface. "Quick, steward," shouted Ahab. "What time is it?" The steward, Doughboy, hurried below deck, checked the time, and reported the exact minute to Ahab. The ship turned away from the wind, and we started slowly rolling forward with it. Tashtego reported that the whales had gone down in the direction of the leeward side, so we fully expected them to surface directly ahead of us. Sperm whales are known to sometimes dive in one direction and then secretly swim off in the opposite direction while underwater, but this time, there was no reason to think that the whales had been spooked or even noticed us. One of the men assigned to stay on the ship took over Tashtego's position at the masthead. The other sailors on watch had come down from their posts. The lines were secured and the cranes were set up. The main yard was backed, and the 3 whaleboats were lowered over the side of the ship like baskets hanging from a cliff. The eager crews, gripping the rail with one hand and standing with one foot on the gunwale, looked ready to spring into action like soldiers preparing to board an enemy ship. But just at that moment, a sudden cry grabbed everyone's attention, pulling their eyes away from the whales. We all turned to stare at Ahab, who was now surrounded by 5 shadowy figures that seemed to have materialized out of thin air. Chapter 48. the first lowering. The figures, which at first appeared ghostly, were moving quickly and silently on the other side of the deck. Without making a sound, they were untying the tackles and bands of the boat that hung there. This boat had always been considered a spare, though it was technically called the captain's boat because it was kept on the starboard side. The man standing at its bow was tall and dark-skinned, with a single white tooth sticking out menacingly from his firm, steel-like lips. He wore a wrinkled black cotton jacket, along with wide black trousers. Crowning this dark figure was a gleaming white turban, with his hair braided and coiled tightly around his head. His companions, less dark in complexion, had the vivid, tiger-yellow skin characteristic of some of the native people from the Philippines, a group that sailors believed had a devilish cunning and were sometimes thought to be spies of the devil himself. As the ship's crew stared in wonder at these strangers, Ahab called out to the turbaned man leading them, "Are you ready, Fedallah?" "Ready," came the half-hissed reply. "Lower the boats, then. Didn't you hear me? Lower away." Ahab shouted across the deck. His voice boomed so powerfully that despite their amazement, the sailors leapt into action. The ropes spun through the pulleys, and with a splash, 3 boats dropped into the sea. With remarkable daring, the sailors swiftly jumped down the side of the ship into the rocking boats below. No sooner had they rowed away from the ship's shadow when a 4th boat, coming from the windward side, appeared at the stern. It was manned by the 5 strangers, rowing Ahab. Standing tall at the boat's stern, Ahab shouted to Starbuck, Stubb, and Flask to spread out and cover a wide area of water. But the crew couldn't stop staring at Fedallah and his mysterious companions, distracted from Ahab's orders. "Captain Ahab," Starbuck started to say. "Spread out," Ahab repeated. "All 4 boats move. Flask, head further to leeward." "Aye, aye, sir," called Flask, enthusiastically steering his boat. "Pull, boys, there she blows right ahead. Pull back hard." "Don't mind those yellow boys, Archie," Flask added. "Oh, I don't care about them, sir," replied Archie. "I knew about them already. Didn't I hear them down in the hold? Didn't I tell Kabako? Right, Kabako? They're stowaways, Mr. Flask." "Pull, pull, my fine fellows," Stubb called to his crew, his voice half playful, half serious. Some of the men were still uneasy. "What are you staring at? Those guys in that boat? Forget about them. They're just extra hands to help us out. Who cares where they came from? More the merrier. Pull. Never mind the brimstone. Devils make good company sometimes. Let's row for that reward. Sperm oil. That's what we're here for. Come on, men. Easy now, but keep pulling. Don't be lazy. Boys, snap your oars. Pull until you break something. Pull like your lives depend on it. Here." Stubb pulled out his knife and jokingly shouted, "Put the blade between your teeth and pull for all you're worth. That's it. Now you're doing it. Let's go, my steel bits. Let's go." Stubb's unusual way of encouraging his crew was unique to him. He had a way of mixing humor with intensity, and even though his words were fierce, the men could tell he wasn't truly angry. This blend of fun and fury made the crew row harder, not out of fear, but from the sheer ridiculousness of it. Stubb himself remained calm, managing the steering oar with an air of lazy ease, often yawning widely as he commanded, which only added to the humor and motivated the crew more. Following Ahab's orders, Starbuck rowed his boat diagonally across Stubb's path, and for a moment, the 2 boats were close enough to speak. "Mr. Starbuck, port side boat. Ahoy! Can I have a word with you, sir?" Stubb called. "Go ahead," replied Starbuck without turning, still urging his crew forward and keeping his focus on the task ahead. "What do you think about those yellow boys?" "They must have been smuggled aboard before we set sail," Starbuck said in a whisper to his crew. Then louder to Stubb. "A bad business, Mr. Stubb, but let's make the best of it. Pull hard, men. We're here for the sperm oil. That's our goal." "Aye, I thought so." Stubb muttered as the boats drifted apart again. "I knew something was up the moment I saw them. That's what Ahab was doing in the hold all those times. It's all about the white whale. Well, nothing to be done now. Let's keep going, men. It's not the white whale today. Keep rowing." The appearance of these strange figures at such a crucial moment had sparked superstitious fear in some of the crew. But Archie's earlier discovery, though not fully believed at the time, had softened the shock. Combined with Stubb's confident explanation, the men were somewhat reassured, though many were still left wondering about Ahab's involvement. I, for one, recalled the shadows I had seen sneaking aboard the Pequod back in Nantucket, as well as the strange warnings of the mysterious Elijah. Meanwhile, Ahab, far ahead of the other boats, was being pulled by his powerful crew. Fedallah and the others rowed with the strength and precision of machines, their strokes propelling the boat forward like the engine of a steamboat. Fedallah, rowing the harpooner's oar, had shed his jacket and exposed his chest, his body outlined against the rolling horizon. At the stern, Ahab, with one arm raised for balance like a fencer, skillfully steered the boat, just as he had done countless times before encountering the white whale. Suddenly, Ahab gave a signal, and the boat's 5 oars stopped at once, leaving them motionless on the water. The other 3 boats, still behind, also paused. The whales had silently dove deep into the ocean, unnoticed by the other crews, but Ahab had seen it from his closer position. "Everyone, keep your eyes on your oars," shouted Starbuck. "Queequeg, stand up!" With agility, Queequeg leaped onto the raised platform at the front of the boat. He stood tall, his eyes eagerly scanning the horizon where the whale was last seen. At the rear, Starbuck calmly balanced himself on the edge of the boat, his gaze locked on the vast blue sea. His steady posture contrasted the boat's jerking movements, but he remained focused and alert. Nearby, Flask's boat was motionless. Flask himself stood daringly on top of the loggerhead, a small post rising from the stern. It was barely larger than a hand, yet Flask balanced on it like a ship's lookout. He was a small man with big ambitions, and standing there wasn't enough for him. "I can't see anything from here. Lift me higher," he demanded. Daggoo, a towering figure, moved swiftly to the back of the boat and offered his strong shoulders as a perch. "A fine lookout, sir. Care to climb up?" he asked. "Indeed. Thank you, though I wish you were 50 feet taller," Flask replied, stepping onto Daggoo's shoulders. Daggoo, using his strength, lifted Flask easily. Flask stood atop Daggoo, holding onto one of his arms for balance. The sight was unusual, as the massive Daggoo swayed with the rolling waves, effortlessly keeping Flask steady. Despite Flask's impatient movements, Daggoo's broad back remained steady, unaffected by his rider's restlessness. Stubb, the third mate, wasn't as concerned with scanning the horizon. The whales might have simply dived deep, so he pulled out his pipe, ready to relax. As he was lighting it, Tashtago, his harpooner, suddenly dropped to his seat, shouting, "They're here! Get ready!" To anyone not experienced in whale hunting, the sea seemed empty, just a patch of disturbed water and some vapor rising from it. But the trained eyes of the whalemen knew better. The whales were just beneath the surface, the vapor they spouted giving away their position. All the boats immediately gave chase. The disturbed water moved quickly ahead of them, like a mass of bubbles racing down a stream. "Pull harder, boys," Starbuck whispered intensely to his crew, his eyes fixed on the target. His whispers, though soft, carried the weight of command. Flask, in contrast, was loud and excitable. "Come on, boys! Pull! I'll give you my land if you get me on their backs," he yelled, tossing his hat into the air and stomping with excitement. Behind him, Stubb followed more casually. "What's the rush?" he drawled, pipe still in his mouth. "Just pull, nice and steady." As the boat sped on, Ahab the captain said nothing to his crew. His intense focus was on the hunt, his mind consumed by the pursuit of his prey. Suddenly, the calm was broken by action. Starbuck's boat lunged forward, and Queequeg, harpoon in hand, stood up. The boat surged through misty waves, closing in on the whale. Starbuck whispered, "There it is, get it!" With a swift motion, Queequeg threw the harpoon, but the whale only grazed the iron and swam off. The boat, thrown by the force of the whale, was nearly capsized, but the crew managed to stay aboard. The storm picked up, and the sea became wild. The crew struggled, soaked and cold, but they were unable to bail out the water as the wind howled and waves crashed around them. Starbuck managed to light a lamp and handed it to Queequeg, who held it aloft as a signal of hope. As dawn broke, the crew, exhausted and despairing, heard the faint creak of a ship. Through the mist, the outline of their vessel appeared, sailing towards them. They abandoned their swamped boat and swam to safety, eventually being hauled aboard. The other boats had returned to the ship earlier, but their own boat had been assumed lost. In the chaos of the storm, they had survived. Chapter 49. The Hyena. There are some strange moments in life when a person sees the whole universe as a vast practical joke, even if he only dimly understands the humor and suspects that the joke is only at his own expense. Yet nothing seems to bring him down, and nothing feels worth arguing about. He swallows all events, beliefs, and hardships, both visible and invisible, without hesitation, just like an ostrich with a powerful stomach that gobbles down bullets and flint. As for small troubles, worries, the possibility of sudden disaster, and even death, all of these seem to him just playful jabs and friendly nudges from some unseen trickster. This odd state of mind usually hits a person during extreme hardship. It sneaks in right in the middle of their seriousness, making what once seemed incredibly important feel like just another part of the big joke. There's nothing like the dangers of whaling to create this carefree, reckless philosophy, and that's how I viewed this entire voyage of the Pequod and its pursuit of the great white whale. "Queequeg," I said as they pulled me, the last man, onto the deck while I shook off the water from my jacket. "Does this kind of thing happen often?" Without much emotion, and just as soaked as I was, he let me know that it did. "Mr. Stubb," I said, turning to him, buttoned up in his oil jacket and calmly smoking his pipe in the rain, "I think I've heard you say that of all whalemen, our chief mate, Mr. Starbuck, is the most careful and prudent. So, is charging straight at a flying whale with your sail up during a foggy squall the pinnacle of a whaleman's discretion?" "Definitely. I've lowered for whales from a leaking ship in a gale off Cape Horn." "Mr. Flask," I said, addressing little King Post, who was standing nearby, "you're experienced in these things, and I'm not. Can you tell me if it's an unchangeable rule in this fishery for a rower to risk breaking his back by pulling himself backward into the jaws of death?" "Can't you phrase that differently?" Flask replied. "Yes, that's the law. I'd like to see a boat crew trying to row up to a whale facing forward. Ha ha! The whale would give them a run for their money." From these three reliable witnesses, I got a clear picture of the whole situation. Considering that squalls and capsizings and spending the night adrift were common in this line of work, considering that at the most critical moment of approaching a whale, I had to trust my life to whoever was steering the boat, often someone who was just as likely to capsize us with his frantic movements. Considering that the disaster to our boat was largely due to Starbuck charging toward the whale almost right into a squall, and yet Starbuck was known for being careful. Considering that I was part of Starbuck's unusually cautious crew, and finally, considering the devilish chase I was involved in concerning the white whale. Putting all of this together, I thought it would be best to go below deck and draft my will. "Queequeg," I said, "come along, you'll be my lawyer, executor, and heir." It may seem odd that sailors would spend time preparing their wills, but they actually enjoy doing it. This was the fourth time in my seafaring life that I had done this. After I completed the process this time, I felt a weight lifted off my heart. All the days I had left would feel like a bonus, as good as the days Lazarus lived after his resurrection. A clean gain of however many months or weeks I had left. I felt like I had outsmarted death. My death and burial were tucked away in my chest. I looked around calmly and contentedly, like a quiet ghost with a clear conscience sitting inside a snug family vault. Now, I thought, unconsciously rolling up my sleeves, it's time for a cool, collected dive into death and destruction. Let the devil take the hindmost. Chapter 50. Ahab's Boat and Crew. Fedallah. "Who would have thought it, Flask?" Stubb exclaimed. "If I only had one leg, you wouldn't catch me in a boat, unless maybe to use my wooden toe to stop up the hole. Oh, he's a remarkable old man." "I don't think that's so strange," Flask replied. "If he had lost his leg at the hip, that would be different. That would really disable him, but he still has one knee and most of the other leg, you know." "I didn't know that, little man. I've never seen him kneel." Among experienced whalers, there has often been debate about whether it's wise for a whaling captain to risk his life in the dangerous chase, given how essential he is to the success of the voyage. This is similar to how Tamerlane's soldiers often cried and argued about whether his invaluable life should be put on the front lines of battle. But for Ahab, the question took on a different angle. Considering that a man with two legs is still clumsy in times of danger, considering that hunting whales always involves tremendous challenges, and considering that each moment is filled with risk, is it wise for any disabled man to join a whaleboat in the hunt? Generally, the co-owners of the Pequod seemed to think not. Ahab knew that even though his friends back home might not think twice about him entering a boat during the less dangerous parts of the chase to give orders in person, he also knew that the idea of him being assigned a boat as a regular headsman in the hunt, especially with 5 extra men for his crew, never crossed the minds of the Pequod's owners. So he never asked for a crew or hinted at his wishes. Still, he made his own private arrangements regarding the matter. Until Kabako's discovery was published, the sailors hadn't expected anything unusual. However, after being at sea for a while, the crew had completed the usual tasks of getting the whaleboats ready. It was later noted that Ahab sometimes took it upon himself to make thole pins for what was thought to be one of the spare boats. And he was even seen carefully cutting the small wooden skewers that are used to pin the line over the groove at the bow when the line is running out. When he was seen being particularly careful about adding an extra layer of sheathing to the boat's bottom to protect against the pressure of his ivory leg, and also adjusting the thigh board, a horizontal piece in the boat's bow for bracing his knee while stabbing at the whale, it sparked a lot of interest and curiosity. Most assumed that Ahab's extra caution was simply to prepare for his ultimate pursuit of Moby Dick, since he had already revealed his intention to hunt that monster in person. However, nobody suspected that a crew would be assigned to his boat. As for the subordinate phantoms, any wonder that remained soon faded away, for in whaling, wonders quickly lose their charm. Besides, now and then, bizarre odds and ends from strange nations appear out of nowhere to crew these floating outlaw ships, and the vessels themselves often pick up peculiar castaways found drifting at sea on planks, bits of wreckage, oars, whaleboats, canoes, and whatnot. Even Beelzebub himself could climb aboard and chat with the captain, and it wouldn't raise any great excitement among the crew. But regardless, while the subordinate phantoms quickly blended in with the crew, still seeming somewhat distinct from them, Fedallah, with his hair turban, remained a mysterious figure until the very end. No one knew where he came from in a world like this, or what strange connection he had with Ahab's unique fate. It even seemed he might have had some sort of subtle influence, maybe even authority over him. Yet no one could maintain an indifferent attitude toward Fedallah. He was the kind of person that civilized, domestic people in temperate regions only see in their dreams, if at all. The sort of being who occasionally glides through the unchanging Asian communities, especially the Eastern Islands, where ancient cultures still preserve much of the primordial essence of Earth's earliest generations. In those places, the memory of the first man was still fresh, and all men, unsure of their origins, regarded each other as real phantoms, questioning the sun and the moon about why they were created. Although, according to Genesis, angels mingled with human women, the devils, as the uncanonical rabbins claimed, also indulged in earthly loves.